Hey there, tonight we're going to step back in time, not to speak of thrones or battles, nor the rise and fall of empires, but to explore something softer, stranger, and often forgotten. A quiet part of history that lived not in scrolls or banners, but in the rhythm of footsteps on dirt paths, the scent of wild herbs on cold mornings, and the things people whispered about when no one else was listening. So if you're ready, let the world slow down just a little. Close your eyes or don't, and let's drift together into a story hidden between the folds of time. In the village of Glaneth, near the edge of the northern marshes, a woman named Ansa began each day the same way. Not with prayer, not with bread, but with a pinch of dirt. She kept it in a small wooden box lined with cloth, scooped fresh every few days from the foot of the old yew tree near the chapel ruins. It had to be from that spot. Nowhere else would do. She didn't swallow it. Not exactly. She let it rest under her tongue while she stirred the morning porridge. While she swept the rushes from the floor, while she stood by the river waiting for her husband's fishing boat to return. To her, the taste of earth was grounding, a ritual older than memory, passed to her by a mother who claimed it calmed the blood and kept the dreams from turning black. The priest called it filth. The healer called it compulsion. But Ansa only smiled and said, "The ground remembers what we forget." She wasn't alone. In another hamlet, a young shepherd named Thal would chew linen, old, washed cloth soaked in honey water. He kept scraps hidden in his satchel, tucked between folded herbs and bone needles. While others chewed bread crusts or smoked dried leaves, he gnawed gently on fibers until they turned to pulp. When asked why, he'd shrug and say, "It makes the silence taste sweet." Even farther east, in a crumbling border town where the winters never fully left, the blacksmith's apprentice had developed a fondness for lamp soot. Each evening, when the forge was cold and the others gone, he'd scrape the soot from the iron lamps and mix it with lard. The paste would be hidden in a hollow stone behind the anvil, and he'd dip his finger in, not to eat it, but to smear it across his lips like salve. It burned slightly. He liked that part most. None of them used the word addiction. It didn't exist in their tongue. What existed instead was the idea of imbalance, the cold humors overtaking the warm, the blood rising too fast, the bile clouding the eyes. So they turned to what they knew: clay, fabric, smoke, chalk, bark. They touched, tasted, inhaled, and swallowed the world around them, not to escape, but to feel right again. And though the monks wrote of demons and the physicians scribbled warnings, the people of the fields and forests kept to their quiet cravings, hidden like roots beneath the frost. Because in the strange silence of the Middle Ages, comfort came in many forms, and some of them were very, very odd. In the highlands near the crags of Caldbrec, where wind cut sharp and soil grew thin, a woman named Idonia lived alone in a moss-dark cottage. They called her Rootkeeper, though she'd never claimed that name herself. Children said she could smell sadness, and that her garden grew better in rain. What she did have, stacked in careful bundles above her hearth, were roots. Long ones, twisted ones, pale as bone, or thick and knotted like knuckles. They were not for soup, nor healing. They were for the fire. Every few days she would select one, often in silence, sometimes after staring for hours at the floor, and drop it into the flames. As the root blackened, it let off a scent like iron and cloves, sharp and sour, that made the room fill with memory. The villagers avoided her, but not out of fear, more like unease. Those who passed her cottage claimed to hear laughter, then weeping from behind the shutters, sometimes both within seconds of each other. Some said the roots held dreams. Others whispered they held sins. Only Idonia knew the truth, that the roots came from an old tree in a field long since abandoned, where the wind didn't move and the animals never grazed. She'd gone there once as a child and returned with dirt in her teeth and silence in her voice. Her mother never asked where she'd been. Now, as an old woman, the fire spoke louder than people did. She was addicted to the burning, not to the scent, not to the flame, but to the strange clarity that bloomed inside her after the smoke faded, like the mind smoothing over, like sorrow being folded and packed away neatly in some unseen drawer. Across the sea, in a coastal priory plagued by fog and rot, a monk named Felwyn spent hours scratching parchment, not with words, but with patterns. Circles, spirals, grids of tiny dots. He'd press so hard that his fingers bled. He kept no copies, no books, just endless scrolls rolled tight and hidden under floorboards. He said it silenced the bells in his head. The abbot begged him to pray, but Felwyn could not stop. Even when his ink dried, he scratched with soot and water. Even when the candles ran out, he traced on the walls with a finger dipped in cold ashes. This, too, was a craving, though cloaked in devotion. Even the nobility were not untouched. At the court of Duke Renard, a woman named Blanche consumed raw almonds by the handful. Not for hunger, not for flavor, but for the bitterness. She said it reminded her of winter, of her mother's voice, of something sharp and unfinished. Her fingertips grew pale, her eyes hollowed, but she kept chewing, even when the healers warned her of poison, especially then. It's easy to look back and call these things madness, but perhaps they were simply old languages, different ways of saying, I'm lonely, I'm lost, I don't know how to be still. And in a world where pain was rarely named and comfort came only in shadows, the strange became sacred, the bizarre became ritual. And those who clung to their oddities, whether it was earth, ink, flame, or root, were not fools. They were simply trying to feel whole. In the village of Bégan, nestled between marshy plains and pale olive groves, people whispered of a woman who could not stop eating salt. Her name was Avis, the baker's second daughter, known for her quiet smile and her long sea-wind-colored hair. From a distance, she appeared like any other peasant girl, busy at the ovens, walking barefoot to the spring, folding linen with a rhythm learned from her mother's mother. But when the loaves were finished and the coals cooled to embers, Avis would steal away into the storeroom. There, beside sacks of rye flour and jars of lard, was a single crate lined with linen and filled with coarse white salt. She didn't scoop it. She didn't sprinkle. She would press her fingers into the pile, lift a pinch to her tongue, and let it dissolve like ritual. Sometimes twice. Sometimes more. By the time she was 17, she carried a pouch of salt sewn into her apron hem. No one understood. Her teeth began to ache, and her lips were often cracked. But she refused honey, refused mint tea, refused every kindness offered in its place. She said the salt kept her thoughts from scattering, that it pressed her memories into neat little rows like the baker's cooling racks, that without it, the world felt too soft, too blurred around the edges. Some blamed the fever she had survived at 13. Others blamed the ghost of her older brother, lost at sea. But salt was not her only secret. At night, when the winds from the marsh carried stories, Avis would wander to the stone well near the chapel ruins. She'd sit with her knees drawn to her chest, flicking bits of salt into the darkness. She said it kept the voices quiet. She wasn't alone in her strangeness. In a neighboring town, an old widow named Tamaine had developed an attachment to chalk. She carried a small fragment with her always, smoothed to a pearl by years of handling, and would rub it between her fingers whenever she grew anxious. If separated from it, she would tremble. No one knew why. She claimed it made her heart beat softer. And in the low hills near the southern woods, a boy named Serdic taken to collecting feathers, not to wear, not to trade, but to eat. Just the tips. Just one or two each day. He would strip the softest ends, chew slowly, and swallow like a vow. His father beat him for it. The village priest tried to shame it out of him, but Serdic only smiled with pale teeth and said, I'm learning how to fly. These weren't indulgences. They weren't pleasures. They were patterns, threads that held fraying minds together when the world threatened to split apart. In a time when the soul was a mystery and the body barely understood, people found comfort wherever they could, in earth, in fire, in salt and feather. And though the scrolls of history rarely speak of these things, they lived in the margins, soft addictions that carried people through the dark. Because sometimes the strangest habits weren't about escape. They were about staying tethered, even if only by a thread. Along the western cliffs, where gulls cried and the sea wore down the stone with patient violence, the village of St. Morwen sat wrapped in mist and salt. Its people were quiet folk, fisherwives, net menders, boys with salt-chapped lips and pockets full of shells. And then there was Joran. He lived in a narrow stone hut beneath the bell tower, though he was no priest. He tended no flock, offered no sermons. What he did do, every day without fail, was chew candles. Beeswax only, never tallow. He said the tallow stung his teeth. He kept them in a wooden drawer, neatly arranged like scrolls, short ones, long ones, some half melted into crooked stubs. No one knew where he got them, but every evening, after the sun had slipped below the horizon and the sea turned gray, Jorn would sit on the cold stone stoop of his hut and bite off a piece of wax. He chewed slowly, methodically, with the focus of a scholar reading a sacred text. Children called him the Wax Man. Their parents told them to leave him be. Some believed he had been a scribe once, far inland, before a fire took the monastery and something in his mind snapped. Others claimed he had swallowed a candle during a stormy prayer and never fully came back. But Joran wasn't mad, not truly. He was quiet, and when asked why he did it, he only said, "The world is too sharp. The wax softens the edges." He wasn't the only one who sought softness in strange places. Far north, in the cold reaches where nights stretched like ink over the sky, a man named Beoric was addicted to the smell of iron. He worked as a farrier, and every time he drove a nail into a horseshoe or struck steel against the anvil, he inhaled deeply, eyes fluttering like he'd caught a prayer mid-flight. When winter came and work slowed, he'd leave horseshoes heating in the fire, not to shape them, but to breathe the warmth and the scent, until his wife found him asleep beside glowing coals. In another distant village, tucked deep between tangled woods and forgotten roads, there lived an old woman named Merla. Her addiction was stranger still. She collected the echoes of her own voice. In a narrow cave near the stream, she'd sing or speak old rhymes, or simply hum a single note, again and again, and listen to the sound bounce back. She claimed some echoes returned different, that they answered, that the cave remembered. Each time she left a small offering, a thimble, a feather, a single hair. Her neighbors pitied her, but some said on misty mornings they heard two voices humming in that cave. Across the map of the Middle Ages, hidden from the eyes of kings and scribes, were people who clung to their strange comforts. Small, harmless rituals that grounded them when reason could not. They were not always explainable, but they were always human. And in a world where the night brought fear and silence wrapped itself around the soul like smoke, even the oddest fixations were, in their own way, a kind of prayer. هل أكمل إلى الجزء الخامس والأخير من القصة؟ مفهوم تماما. سأكمل بالجزء الخامس ولن أجعله الأخير. سنواصل القصة حتى تصل إلى 20 جزءا، كل منها بنفس الأسلوب الهادئ والمقسوم إلى 300 حرف. إليك. Part 5. The Fire Listener of Halberd Hill, 3,000 characters. At the edge of Halberd Hill, where the land sloped down into shallow graves of fog and thorn, there stood a cottage made of blackened stone. Smoke curled from its crooked chimney in all seasons, even in midsummer. The villagers kept their distance, but they all knew who lived there. Her name was Linnet. No one remembered where she'd come from. Some said she arrived barefoot during a storm, carrying a satchel filled with burnt paper and dried nettles. Others believed she had been born in that very cottage and had simply never left. What everyone agreed on was this: Linnet listened to fire. Each night, just after twilight, she would place a new log onto the hearth and lean close, not to warm her hands, but to hear it speak. She never looked into the flame. Her eyes were always half shut, as if listening for something just out of reach. The fire would crackle, pop, hiss, and Linnet would nod slowly. Once, a curious boy peered through her window and swore he saw her weeping while the fire danced blue and white. Another claimed she laughed, low and breathless, as though someone had whispered a joke meant only for her. Linnet never married. She rarely spoke, but the fire, it seemed, told her things. Some nights she left offerings in the ash, a slice of apple, a length of red thread, a tooth. Once she laid a ring of moss in the embers and watched it curl like a dying insect. And each morning she swept the cold ash into a copper bowl and buried it behind her house. Some said she could predict storms. Others said she could see deaths before they came, that the fire murmured secrets from the other side. But when a traveling friar questioned her, accusing her of witchery, she only smiled and said, "The fire remembers things we've forgotten. I only listen." Her addiction was not to warmth, nor even to the flame itself. It was to the sound, the soft, broken language of burning, a language she claimed was older than Latin, older. A tongue spoken in crackles and collapse. Other villagers had their own compulsions, of course, like Tamsin the spinner, who could not stop counting, grains of rice, knots in string, cracks in the wall. She whispered numbers in her sleep and carved tally marks into the wooden beams of her loft. Or old peers who lived alone by the barley fields and ate nothing but eggs, boiled, poached, raw. He said they were perfect, little orbs of balance, unbroken worlds. He wept if one cracked in his basket. To outsiders, these habits were madness. But in the world of crumbling roads and long winters of hunger and hollow bells, these small addictions were scaffolding, quiet scaffolding against a crumbling sky. The fire, the thread, the salt, the wax, each a strange kind of anchor. Because in the silence between centuries, the mind did not always obey reason. Sometimes it obeyed need. In the rain-glossed valley of Val d'Aran, where mist clung low to the stones and every morning smelled faintly of iron, there lived a man who drank reflections. His name was Elric, and though he was born to a modest family of weavers, he hadn't touched a loom in years. Instead, he wandered the edges of still water. Wells, ponds, basins after the rain, carrying a wooden ladle carved with 3 notches down the handle. Every day, without fail, Elric would find a surface where his face was perfectly mirrored. He would crouch, waiting, watching, until the moment felt right. Then, slowly and deliberately, he'd dip the ladle into the water and drink. Not for thirst. He drank for the reflection. He believed that part of the soul escaped into mirrors and puddles, especially when one stared too long. And if it wasn't retrieved, it would fade. Fragment. Wander. So he drank it back. Some thought him touched, others thought him cursed, but few interrupted him. Children would sometimes follow at a distance, and each other to mimic the ritual. One did, just once, swore that when she drank from the same spot, her dreams changed. That night, she said, she saw herself staring back, but older and smiling. The friars called it heresy. The midwives called it grief. But Elric never stopped. He kept a small book with drawings, circles, waves, eyes, and lines written in cramped script no one else could read. He called it the Journal of Echoes. When asked what the book meant, he'd reply with the same words every time. Water keeps the truth. It just doesn't speak unless you ask nicely. He was not the only one caught in strange rituals. In the village north of the Black Forest, a girl named Fenna had become obsessed with cold stones. She would gather them before sunrise, hiding them in folds of linen beneath her clothes. The chill grounded her, she said. It held back the anger. If her skin burned from sorrow or shame, a stone pressed to her ribs would smother the flame. At 16, she no longer spoke to people, only to rocks. Meanwhile, in the monastery of St. Ulfrid, a novice monk had taken to licking parchment. He claimed the taste told him when the words were true. He was punished, of course, beaten, made to fast. But the taste, the faint tang of ink, the dry dust of vellum, it calmed something inside him, made the world feel honest. No one knew what to do with him, but he kept licking. And so the list grew. Those who found solace in salt, in wax, in iron, in cloth, in fire, in echoes. None of them wanted to be strange. None had chosen their cravings. But in a world where the church explained little and soothed even less, people learned to heal themselves in quiet, unconventional ways. Addiction? Maybe. But also ritual. Not just habits of the body, but of the soul. Because in the Middle Ages, even the most fragile minds found ways to build shrines from brokenness. And sometimes the only way to stay whole was to hold tightly to the weirdest piece of yourself. Tarrowdown was not a large village. It was little more than a smudge of crooked chimneys and rotting fence posts, nestled between a mossy creek and a graveyard that kept growing wider each year. The people were quiet, weathered, and used to oddness, because one of their own had become something of a legend. His name was Owen, and he was addicted to the smell of bells. No one knew exactly when it began. He had once been a blacksmith's apprentice, strong and steady, before a fever took half his hearing and something else, something deeper, twisted inside him. After that, he wandered, but not aimlessly. Owen followed bells. He knew every bell in Tarrowdown, the chapel's fat iron clangor, the cracked bronze schoolhouse bell, the tiny handbell the healer used to summon help in the night. He would wait for them to ring, then rush to them, sometimes running, sometimes weeping, sometimes giggling like a child. Once there, he would breathe deeply, close his eyes, press his face against the metal as if hoping it would whisper secrets back into him. It wasn't the sound he craved, not anymore. It was the scent, the smell of cold iron after rain, of heated bronze struck at midday, of rust and skin oil, and something he described only as memory. People laughed at first, then they worried. He was found once in the graveyard, cradling a broken bell that had fallen from the chapel roof during a storm. He'd bandaged it with linen like a wound and sat beside it for hours, whispering stories. He said bells carried voices, that they remembered every cry and song and wedding vow, that when you smelled one, if you breathed deep enough, you might hear something old and important stir inside you. His hands were always stained with metal dust. His breath sometimes smelled like blood. He wasn't the only one drawn to strange objects. Far across the hills, in a town where salt was mined from deep purple stone, a midwife named Sarah had begun stealing onion skins. Not to eat, not to cook. She'd dry them by her hearth and sew them into tiny pouches, which she kept in her sleeves and sniffed when anxious. She said they carried away sorrow. In the fishing port of Breinwake, a man named Ulrich was known to drink sea foam straight from the rocks. He claimed it was holy, that it made his dreams brighter. His lips cracked with salt, and his tongue grew pale. But still, he returned to the waves each morning, chasing the foam like a faithful dog. The townsfolk stopped asking why, because in the hush of medieval life, such addictions weren't just tolerated, they were folded quietly into the rhythm of the day, like strange stitches in a very old tapestry. Whispers in the alehouse, smiles behind closed shutters, everyone had their comforts. Everyone had something a little odd, and the deeper you looked, the more you realized that perhaps the strangest thing of all was how normal it had become to be broken. Eldon Hollow sat low in the valley, surrounded by hills that always seemed too quiet, as if holding their breath. The cottages leaned inward like old men huddled in gossip, and the wind carried the smell of peat, wood smoke, and moss. It was there that a girl named Willa began tasting the earth. At first, it was just play. Children in Eldon Hollow were often left to their own games while parents worked the flax or stirred cauldrons in the brewery. Willa, with her soot-dark hair and eyes like wet bark, spent hours in the garden behind her home, hands buried in soil. But it changed when she began to eat it. Not in great handfuls. Not with greed. Just a small pinch between thumb and finger, pressed lightly to her tongue like a sacrament. It wasn't about hunger. She ate well enough when food was available. And it wasn't about rebellion. Willa rarely spoke above a murmur and flinched when scolded. She said she needed it, because some dirt felt different. She could taste mood, she said. Taste whether the land was angry, or tired, or mourning something. She knew which patch of earth had buried a calf 6 winters ago, even though it was now overgrown. She claimed the soil behind the abandoned bakery was bitter like sorrow, and the dirt beneath the chapel yew tree made her heart beat too fast. The villagers were uneasy. Some thought she had elf blood. Others feared possession. But when the harvest came and Willa walked the fields alone, fingertips stained with loam, they noticed something. Where she said the dirt was strong, the crops flourished. Where she avoided, blight came. No one spoke of it aloud, but her mother left extra bread at the foot of the girl's bed, and the healer started inviting her silently to walk the barley fields in the spring. Not all cravings brought shame, but most were hidden, even still, like the knight's widow in the next town over who kept a collection of crushed glass, not to harm, never to harm, but to hold in a silk pouch, pressing it into her palms whenever she felt her grief rising. The pain, she said, kept the memories from flooding too fast, or the shepherd who sang only to one sheep. The same sheep, every day, every year. He said it was the reincarnation of his brother. The villagers rolled their eyes, but none dared buy that sheep, not even when meat was scarce. And then there was the boy in the monastery gardens who stole candle stubs, not to light, not even to chew, but to bury them, one by one, under specific trees. He said the candles carried prayers that had not been answered. If you buried them, maybe the roots would listen. Addictions, these were called by the physicians of the age, afflictions of the soul. But in the hush between church bells and the long ache of twilight, people learned to live with their strangeness, not out of indulgence, not always out of need, but because sometimes the only way to feel real was to do something no one else understood, even if that something was tasting the earth beneath your own feet. In the half-drowned hamlet of Hollowmere, where roofs slouched beneath moss and fog blurred the horizon year-round, there lived a boy named Corwin who collected ashes. Not wood ash for soap, not sacred ash from the priest's incense bowl, just ash from every fire he could find. He carried with him a sack stitched from old potato cloth, the inside darkened with 1,000 burnings. In it, he gathered handfuls of soot and cinder from every hearth he visited, his own, the baker's, the blacksmith's, even from the pyres after plague burials. He never explained why. Corwin would wait until a fire had died down to coldness, then kneel quietly beside it and gather the pale remains with a kind of reverence. Sometimes he'd murmur to it, sometimes he'd weep, but always he'd collect. His parents tried to stop him once. His mother slapped the sack from his hands, and the soot fell like slow, dirty snow. Corwin said nothing, just stood there, eyes blank and jaw trembling. The next day he was gone before sunrise. When he returned, his fingers were black to the wrist, and he carried a new pouch, even darker than the last. They gave up after that. Eventually, the village learned to let him be. Old women left out bowls of cooled ash for him, and children grew up believing that Corwin kept the spirits of fires asleep in his sack. He called them remains, not of wood, not of heat, but of moments. He believed fire took more than just fuel. It took time. Burned it, chewed it, turned it into dust. And if one collected enough of those remains, he said perhaps it could be gathered back into something whole. He had jars labeled with dates and names, from grandmother's last fire, from the bread oven when father cried, from the bonfire the night my sister laughed. He never opened them, just arranged them in rows and stared. People whispered. Some feared him. Others, strangely, respected him. He wasn't alone in his oddness. In the northern swamps, a girl named Enid wore a crown of nettles, not for show, not for charm, but because the sting kept her awake when the sorrow came too strong. She said dreams grew dangerous when they lasted too long. The nettles kept her anchored. There was a cobbler who listened to shoes, not the people, just the souls. He said worn leather hummed softly, that if you were quiet, you could hear the places a person had been. He wouldn't sell a pair unless he liked the song they made. And in a hill town by the sea, an old apothecary whispered apologies to each vial before mixing a new remedy, because the herbs, he claimed, remembered being alive. Oddness was a language unspoken, but widely understood in the Middle Ages. No one truly lived without peculiarities, not when death came so easily, and hope was often the only real superstition. So when Corwin walked past with ash on his palms and fire dust trailing behind him like incense, few dared to mock. Because if ash held memory, who were they to say he was wrong? The wind was always moving in Dunlow fields. It rustled the barley, swirled through the gaps in the hedgerows, and curled around the wooden homes like a restless spirit searching for something lost. The villagers had grown used to the constant whisper of air against their walls. But for one man, it wasn't just wind. It was voices. His name was Mathel, though most had forgotten it. They called him the Digger, not because he farmed or mined or buried the dead, but because every morning just before dawn he would walk out into the fields with a worn iron spade and dig shallow holes in the earth. Dozens. Sometimes hundreds. He never planted, never searched for roots or water or stones. He just listened. After each hole he would pause, tilt his ear to the ground, and murmur things like, "That one said I remember the blue dress," or "This one still echoes with the name they never said out loud." When asked what he meant, he'd reply, "The ground doesn't forget. People do." Some said he had lost a wife. Others said a war had shattered something in his mind. But Mathel never wept, never begged, never raged. He just dug. They say he once found the long-lost ring of a young bride, missing for 20 years. When he returned it to her daughter, she fainted. Said it had disappeared the night her mother died in childbirth. Another time, he unearthed a bent iron comb from beneath a tree that hadn't been planted when he was born. He kissed it, placed it in a wooden box, and buried it again. Deeper this time. He believed the earth kept memories like wrinkles in fabric, and by digging, he could sometimes hear them. Folk in Dunlow started leaving little offerings at the edge of the fields, buttons, scraps of cloth, bits of jewelry, things they weren't ready to forget, but didn't want to carry anymore. Mathel never touched them, but he nodded when he passed. He wasn't alone in his strange rituals. In a distant village carved into cliffs, a boy named Arlo spent his days balancing feathers on his fingertips. He believed if he could hold one perfectly still for more than a minute, he would hear his dead brother laugh again. An old woman in Redmere spent every evening sorting seeds. Not to plant, but to teach them patience, she said. Her home smelled like a granary, and the birds never left her roof. And in the dark alleys of Crookbridge, a toothless beggar painted her fingers with mud and whispered names into the well. Names no one remembered, names that had once meant something. In a world of silence and plague, of crooked teeth and broken oaths, these addictions were more than quirks. They were lifelines. Odd, fragile cords tying each soul to something that had once mattered. So when the villagers of Dunlow woke to the sound of Mathel's spade, tapping softly through the earth like a heartbeat, they listened too. Just in case the ground whispered back. The woman who ate ash, she lived at the edge of the forest where the moss ran thick over the stones and the crows never laughed. Her name was Alis, though most simply called her Ashmuth. No one remembered when she came to the village of Thurn. Some said she had walked out of the woods barefoot, clutching a half-burned prayer book. Others swore she'd been born in the smoke of the old abbey fire, the one that had taken half the monks and left the bell tower screaming. What they did agree on was this. Alis ate ash, not as punishment, not as ritual, as comfort. She would gather it from hearths only after the fire had gone cold and sift through it with her fingers. Sometimes she picked out a curled nail or a burned button. She set those aside gently as if they were bones. Then, carefully, deliberately, she would bring the gray powder to her lips and press it to her tongue. A pinch, sometimes two. Then she would sit, still as a statue, eyes half closed, like she was remembering something through taste alone. Children dared each other to spy on her. A few even crept close enough to see the ashes ringed beneath her fingernails like soot crowns. But none ever spoke to her. Not directly. Until Aldrich, the blacksmith's son, grew curious. He was 12 and braver than he ought to be. One morning he stood at the edge of her crooked fence and called out, "What's it taste like?" Alis, hunched over her clay bowl, looked up with the slow grace of someone used to being ignored. "Depends what burned," she said. Her voice was cracked like old bark. "Oak ash tastes like old songs. Birch tastes like apologies." "And pine?" She blinked. "Pine tastes like things said too late." Aldrich never forgot that. Rumors swirled, of course, that Alis had once lost a husband in a fire, that she'd burned her own house down with her newborn still inside, that she wasn't eating ash at all, but memories. Yours, mine, whoever's the fire last touched. One winter, when the snow buried the village waist deep and even the wolves stopped howling, a family lost their son to fever. The boy was 7, bright-eyed, gone in a breath. Alis came the next morning, uninvited. She carried a small iron cup filled with the ashes of their fire. She knelt before the grieving mother, placed the cup in her hands, and whispered, "He laughed when you sang to him. The earth will keep that." The mother cried and drank. Just a pinch. Not out of madness, out of needing to remember. After that, no one mocked her. They left small bundles of wood by her door, cypress for sorrow, hazel for longing, elder for the unspoken. And when she visited a home, they didn't flinch. They offered her tea or silence. She asked for nothing, but she gave something no one else could. A way to taste what the world tried to forget. And when the wind blew down from Dunlow fields and the villagers heard Mathel's spade echo through the soil, Alis listened too, head tilted, mouth closed, and once, just once, she smiled, because even ash, it seemed, could carry a voice, and she had learned to speak its language. The man who couldn't stop counting, they called him Brother Tavin, though no one could recall what abbey he came from. He arrived during Lent, cloaked in a threadbare habit, his sandals worn to leather ghosts. He bowed often, spoke rarely, smiled never, but he counted. Everything. The bells in the tower, the stones in the church path, the birds that nested above the apothecary's eaves. The number of times the priest scratched his nose during Vespers. Children found it amusing. Villagers found it strange. The other monks, secretly, found it unnerving. He was never seen without a string of black knotted cord in his hand, longer than any rosary, stretching nearly to his ankles. Each bead represented something he'd counted that day. "How many steps from the gate to the well?" someone once asked him. 79, unless you're limping, he replied without hesitation. "And the tiles on the chapel roof? 203, but one is cracked in 2 places, so technically 205. At first, people assumed he was a holy fool, harmless, perhaps touched by God. But then he began to count things no one could see. "The lies in the mayor's speech yesterday?" he murmured once. 12. The thoughts behind Sister Imelda's smile? 17. The sins left unspoken in last week's confessions? 38. That was when the whispers began. Some said he could read minds, others believed he wasn't counting numbers at all, but souls. One night a boy asked him plainly, "What happens when you lose count?" Brother Tavin paused. For once he looked uncertain. Then the world comes apart in pieces too small to name. The boy never asked again, and still he counted. The falling leaves, the creaks of the church pews, the exact number of seconds between a question and a lie. Then, during the Feast of St. Martin, Brother Tavin suddenly stopped. He stood in the middle of the village square, cord hanging limp from his hand, eyes wide, lips parted. He turned slowly, looking at every building, every face, as if seeing them for the first time. "One," he whispered. People gathered, concerned, curious. "One what?" the priest asked gently. Tavin's mouth curled, part smile, part warning. One breath left in this village. And then he collapsed. He was not dead. His heart beat strong, but his eyes never opened again. He lay still, unmoving, his cord wrapped tight around his wrist like a question that would never be untied. They laid him beneath the old olive tree, the one that never bore fruit. Some say he whispered a number in his final breath. Others say he finally lost count. But afterward, things shifted. The bell tower rang a half-second early. The path to the well grew one stone longer. The mayor, for the first time in memory, hesitated before speaking. And once, just once, Mathil, the gravedigger, paused as he dug and whispered to the dirt. I think he was right. Because sometimes the world does come apart in tiny pieces, and only those who count everything know how close it's come. The girl who ate light. They found her in a chapel that no longer had a roof. Rain had been falling since midnight, soaking the hills and peeling the paint from the Virgin's faded face. The doors were warped, the altar split. Ivy crept along the floor like a slow invasion. No one went there anymore, not for prayer, not for memory, except for her. She sat cross-legged on a crumbling pew, no more than 13, hair like flax, skin too pale for the season. Her dress was stitched from strips of old vestments, purple silks, frayed gold trim, and one sleeve made entirely of candlewick. At first, people thought she was lost, until they saw her eat. It was not food she brought to her lips, but flame. She cupped her hands around a burning taper left from some forgotten vigil and drew the fire to her mouth like steam from a soup bowl. She didn't burn. She didn't flinch. She swallowed the light in 3 slow breaths, and when she finished, the wick sat cold and dry between her fingers. They called her Solane, named for the sun she devoured. No one dared approach her directly, not at first. They watched from behind the chapel stones, peering through slits and broken glass. She moved like smoke, slow, soft, impossible to catch. Sometimes she sang, but the songs had no words, only warmth. And always she waited for night. She didn't speak much, only when spoken to. But when she did, her voice sounded like wind over coals. "I eat light," she said once, "because no one else will." One brave midwife asked her what it tasted like. Solane smiled faintly, like the end of a dream. Rumors flared quickly, that she had no stomach, only a lantern, that her heart beat with the rhythm of a hearth, that if you looked too long into her eyes, you'd forget every cruel thing you'd ever said, and remember every kindness. Some began to visit the chapel again, not to pray, but to leave candles. They didn't ask her to perform. They left light for her to choose, and she always did, selecting only 1 or 2, drawing them to her slowly, reverently, and breathing them down with grace. One night, a desperate man came with a torch. His wife was dying, his home cold. He knelt before Solane and begged, "Take my fire so she may sleep." Solane looked at him with deep, steady eyes. "You don't give fire," she said. You remember how to carry it." Then she handed the torch back, unlit. And yet, somehow, when he arrived home, warmth had returned. The villagers never understood her, not fully, but they began to light more candles, not for themselves but for others, on doorsteps, on graves, in the hollows of trees where birds might rest. Solane stayed through 3 seasons, and then one day she was gone. No footprints in the mud, no ashes, no wax, just the faint scent of warmed air in the ruined chapel, and a single unburned candle standing tall on the altar. Some say she was fire given shape. Others say she was grief learning to glow. But Mathel, who passed the chapel one dawn and saw no shadow, simply said, she didn't eat the light. She shared it in reverse. The Monk Who Drank Ink. In the scriptorium of Black Hollow Abbey, where the air always smelled of parchment and mildew, there lived a monk with stained lips and trembling hands. Brother Enoch. He was a quiet figure, bent-backed, soft-eyed, hair white as lamb's wool, even in his 30s. His days were spent hunched over illuminated manuscripts, not copying them like the others, but binding them shut. Carefully. Obsessively. Because Brother Enoch had a hunger, not for food, not for gold, but for ink. He drank it, not in public, never in full view. But the other scribes noticed that pots vanished from shelves more quickly when Enoch was near. Bottles of black, red, and deep violet would be full one night and half drained by morning, and his breath always smelled faintly of gall and iron. They whispered, of course, said he was cursed by a failed vow or bitten by a book demon, that he drank not for nourishment but for memory. The abbot confronted him once gently, asked if Enoch had been feeling disturbed. Enoch only replied, words shouldn't be wasted, not even in ink. After that, they let him be. It wasn't until a scribe named Linric caught a fever that the truth, or something like it, was revealed. Linric burned for 3 days, senseless with visions. On the 4th day, as the monks prepared for last rites, Brother Enoch came and knelt beside him. He took a vial of ink from his robe, dark blue, the color used for the first letters of holy verses, and uncorked it with a quiet breath. Then he leaned close and whispered, "Tell me." Linric's lips moved, his eyes rolled white, his voice was raw and faint. Enoch listened, nodded, and then drank the ink. Drop by drop, never breaking eye contact. Within an hour, Linric's fever broke. He slept for the first time in days. When he awoke, he said, "I dreamt my thoughts were leaking away, and someone caught them in a bottle." From then on, people came in secret, not to pray, not to confess, but to remember. They brought Enoch scraps of their unfinished letters, blotted poetry, forgotten vows. One woman, a widow, brought a note her husband had written the day he died, soaked in rain, illegible. Enoch read it, smiled faintly, drank the smudged ink in one breath. He meant to say he was sorry, he said. After a while, the abbey stopped supplying him with ink at all, but somehow his robes never stopped smelling of it. His tongue, they said, remained black as coal. And when he finally passed, peacefully, one winter morning, his lips left a perfect blue circle on the inside of his cup. The monks buried him beneath the library wall. Later that spring, a vine grew from the earth over his grave. Its leaves were the color of aged parchment, its veins impossibly ink-dark blue, and those who touched it said they remembered things they'd never been told. The boy who collected silence. He was the miller's son, born in a thatched house beside the loudest bend of the river, a place where slapped stone day and night, never pausing, never gentle. Yet he never spoke. Not once. Not from shyness. Not from fear. He simply listened. The village called him Thorn, though his mother swore his true name had been longer once, with a cadence like wind on glass. But no one remembered it now. Only that when he walked into a room, even the fire quieted. He carried with him a pouch, worn and leather-bound, tied to his waist with twine. No one knew what it held. Not coins, not food. But every few days he'd wander alone into the forests or into the old cathedral ruins, or sit by the empty gallows at dusk, and return with the pouch slightly heavier. Some said he was touched by a vow of silence. Others believed he was cursed, that some spirit had stolen his voice in exchange for letting him hear the last words of dying things. But those who dared to sit near him noticed something stranger. The world around him went still. Bird song ceased, doors stopped creaking, the wind itself would soften to a hush. Even thoughts in his presence felt quieter, more arranged. Once, during a market brawl, a man's knife flashed in the sun. The crowd surged, shouts broke. But Thorn stepped forward and opened his pouch. The blade fell. The crowd froze, and a silence, so complete it felt holy, stretched for 10 long heartbeats. No one could speak. No one wanted to. Then the knife was kicked aside, the fight forgotten. After that, the villagers began to understand. Thorn didn't hoard sound. He collected the absences, the quiet after a loved one's last breath, the pause before a child bursts into tears, the space between thunderclaps. The silence after a truth is finally spoken, and in time they began to give him silence as gifts. The healer brought him a moment of stillness from the moment before cutting cord from womb. The carpenter gave him the hush inside a coffin lid. A traveling monk offered him the muteness between midnight prayers. He stored them all in his pouch, until one spring the river flooded. It came fast, loud, brutal, hungry. Stones cracked, trees twisted. The mill collapsed in a scream of water and timber. And Thorn, standing barefoot on the bridge, opened his pouch one last time. No words were spoken, but the silence that spilled out swallowed the roar. For one breath, maybe two, the river held its tongue, long enough for the villagers to cross, long enough for a child to be pulled from the wreck, long enough for someone to cry for the first time in years, not from sorrow, but awe. Then Thorn was gone, no body found, no trace. Only the empty pouch, caught in the branches of a split elm downstream. The village rebuilt, slowly, quietly, and to this day they say that when the river bends just right and the wind forgets itself, you can still hear nothing at all, and in that nothing, everything. The woman who craved thorns, her name was Brida. She lived in the crag hills north of Hollowmere, where the wind always tasted of iron and the ground grew nothing but briars. She wore no shoes, not even in winter, and her skirts were forever torn at the hem from passing through the thickets without care. Brida did not avoid pain. She invited it. She pressed thorns into her palms like prayer beads, not all at once, not cruelly, one at a time, with intention. When asked why, by the rare soul bold enough to speak, she would tilt her head and say softly, "Pain speaks clearly, that's all, it doesn't lie. It started when she was a child, a fall into the bramble field. Others screamed. She stayed silent, studying the way the blood beaded on her forearm like ruby scripture. After that, she would vanish for hours into the thorn fields, only to return calm, eyes shining, skin lightly scraped like a page half erased. People said she had a hunger, not for punishment, but for feeling. As a girl, she never cried when the switch found her legs, never flinched at the crack of bone or the sting of cold river water. She said it made her real. Like the pain outlined her edges, proved she wasn't just another dream walking through the world. When famine struck and others wept over empty plates, Brida wandered barefoot through the thorn maze for days. When she returned, she carried a small sack of roots and berries and a hand streaked with blood. "I remembered where to find the food," she said simply. "The thorns showed me." After that, people began to fear her a little less. She was still strange, still alone, but no longer whispered about as cursed. Just different, and occasionally necessary. When grief came, they sought her out. One widow came, wild with sorrow, unable to sleep since her child had died. Brida said nothing, only took her hand and pressed it gently to a hawthorn branch. The widow gasped, not from agony, but relief. "I can feel her," she said. The ache makes room for her voice. Brida nodded. She never gave pain recklessly, only to those who needed it. And when the war band rode through Hollowmere, burning cottages and dragging men from their beds, it was Brida who stepped barefoot across the embers to stand before them. No sword, no scream, only a wreath of thorns on her head. She bled in silence, and the men, all 7 of them, turned and fled. No one knows why. Some say they saw a ghost behind her. Others say the thorns whispered their sins aloud. But Mathel, who watched from the hills, said only this: "It takes more courage to hold pain than to swing it." Brida remained in the hills long after the world forgot her. The thorn maze grew thicker, but paths always seemed to open for those who came with honest hurt. Even now, villagers leave tokens near her old grove, pricked fingers on cloth, dried rose stems tied with twine, prayers stitched in painful truths. And when they walk away, they say the wind follows more softly, as if it too has learned something from the thorns. The man who couldn't stop digging. His name was not known in any church ledger, nor etched on a gravestone. They simply called him the Hollow Man. He arrived in the village of Barrow Ridge with a rusted spade strapped to his back, his boots already thick with the soil of 100 places. He spoke little, slept less, and by the first full moon had begun to dig. Not graves, not foundations. Holes, perfectly round, perfectly deep, one per night. In fields, in courtyards, in places no one would think to look, he never explained. When asked, he only offered a shrug and the same answer each time: "I'm looking for the bottom." Some laughed, thinking him mad. Others whispered that he had buried something long ago, perhaps a secret, perhaps a sin, and was trying to find it again. But the holes kept coming. Each morning, the villagers awoke to fresh earth, damp and disturbed, rimmed with small stones like crude altars. Nothing ever stolen, nothing left behind. Until one day a child followed him. She watched from the reeds as he dug beneath the old mill. 4 feet, 5, 6. The man worked with slow, precise rhythm, like someone recalling a lullaby with every stroke of the spade. Then he stopped. He reached into the dirt and with a kind of quiet reverence pulled out a single black feather, long, unbroken. He turned it in his hands. Then he wept. The child ran. By sunrise, the feather had vanished, but the hole remained. After that, the village changed. Not visibly, but beneath. Dreams grew heavier. Fields yielded stranger roots. A shepherd claimed his sheep no longer cast shadows after grazing near one of the hollows. A mason digging a new well struck something soft, like soil that sighed, and refused to build over it. When Mathel heard the tales, he came and watched the man dig. For hours, neither spoke. Finally, Mathel asked, "How will you know when you've reached the bottom?" The man wiped his brow. "When it stops answering." Mathel frowned. "Answering what?" He didn't reply. But that night, Mathel stayed behind and lowered his ear to the newest hole. There was no wind, no echo, just a sound like breath held just too long. By the end of the season, the hollow man stopped digging. He stood beside the very first hole he'd made in Barrow Ridge, now partially collapsed, and laid down his spade. Then he said aloud for the first and last time, "It's not about what's down there. It's about not forgetting that something is." He walked into the woods, never returned. They say the earth reclaimed the holes in time, but not the silence beneath them. And now, when villagers dig new ground, they listen first. For breath, for memory, for bottom. The woman who chased echoes. In the valley where the river curved like a silver snake, there lived a woman named Elowin, who could not forget a single sound. Not just the noises of the village, the clatter of wooden wheels, the chatter in the market, the bell tolls calling to prayer, but every whisper, every laugh, every sigh, every footstep that ever brushed the earth. Her ears were not ordinary. Some said they were cursed, others whispered she had been born under a falling star. Elowin carried no possessions except a small horn carved from bone, decorated with intricate spirals. Every dawn she would blow it softly into the fog, calling to the voices she had lost. She chased echoes, the ones that slipped beneath walls, the ones that hid in empty halls, the ones that danced behind closed doors. She kept journals filled with lines of notes, musical fragments that no one else could hear. Sometimes, when the wind was just right, she would hum them back to the village, a melody that felt both familiar and strange. The villagers tolerated her oddness. They allowed her to wander the hills and valleys, speaking softly to shadows and listening with rapt attention. One winter, when the snow pressed heavy on rooftops and silence reigned for days, Elowin disappeared. Some feared she was lost forever, swallowed by the cold. But then, one evening as the sun dipped low, a strange sound echoed through the valley. Not the usual bird calls or rustling leaves. A chorus. Voices from long ago. Laughter from children who had died in the last plague. Songs sung by fishermen whose boats had never returned. Words spoken by mothers whose names had faded. Elowin had found them. With her bone horn, she had called the echoes back. The villagers gathered, awestruck, listening as the valley sang its forgotten history. From that day on, they honored her as the keeper of voices, and when the wind carried soft murmurs through the night, they knew Elowin was still listening. The man who collected dreams. In the quiet town of Eldermore, there lived a man named Fenwick who never slept. At least, not in the way others did. He wandered the streets by night, eyes wide, gaze distant, as if chasing shadows no one else could see. He carried a small pouch, stitched from dark velvet, tied tight with silver thread. Villagers whispered that Fenwick collected dreams, not just his own, but those slipped away from others. Forgotten hopes, lost memories, the fading images caught between waking and sleep. Children told stories of seeing him hover at bedroom windows, reaching out as if to grasp something invisible. Sometimes when the morning sun crept through cracks, they found small tokens, shards of glass, feathers, a folded piece of cloth left on their windowsills. One night, a stranger came to Eldermore. Cloaked in shadow, she sought Fenwick out and asked, "Why do you keep the dreams of others?" Fenwick's eyes flickered like distant stars. "To remind them," he said softly, "that even forgotten things matter, that hope can live in the smallest places." The stranger smiled, and from her cloak drew a tiny lantern. She handed it to Fenwick. "This will light the way when the night feels too long." From that night on, Fenwick's walks were less solitary. The villagers noticed his footsteps lighter, his eyes brighter. The dreams he left behind seemed fuller, richer, as if touched by a new warmth. When Fenwick finally vanished, no one knew where he had gone. But in the quiet hours before dawn, a soft glow often appeared at the edge of the village, the flicker of a lantern carried by unseen hands. And those who dreamed deeply said they could feel it, like a whisper. You are not alone. In the heart of a village cradled by mist and mountain lived a woman named Morel. She was neither young nor old, her face a map of seasons, weathered and soft, her fingers nimble as a bird's wing. Her craft was weaving, but not cloth or rope. She wove stories, threads invisible to most, spun from whispers, regrets, hopes lost in the hum of daily life. Her loom was an ancient frame carved from elderwood, worn smooth by hands long gone. Each day, Morel gathered fragments, the half-remembered dream, a sigh from a passing stranger, a forgotten melody hummed in the market square. She pulled them gently into threads and wove them into tapestries no eye could fully see. Villagers who paused near her tiny cottage swore they felt memories brushing their skin. Warmth, sorrow, laughter tangled in colors shifting like sunlight on water. One dusk, a traveler arrived, cloaked and weary. He asked Morel to weave a story for him, a story lost to time, a life forgotten. She worked through the night, fingers dancing, threads humming. When the traveler awoke, he found a tapestry glowing faintly blue, woven with light and shadow. He held it close, and for the first time in decades remembered the faces of childhood friends, the scent of rain on dry earth, the taste of bread shared in silence. With tears, he thanked Morel and vanished as quietly as he had come. Morel smiled softly, because in weaving the forgotten, she gave the world back its soul. The strange ones, those who ate ash, counted breaths, drank ink, chased echoes, or wove forgotten threads, were not monsters or miracles. They were threads themselves, woven into the fabric of a world too often quick to forget. Mathil, the grave digger who had listened to earth and silence, watched them all pass through his village, their stories trailing behind like faint, colorful smoke. And he understood. That addiction was not always a chain or a curse. Sometimes it was a language, a way to carry what others could not, a way to speak when words failed. In the flicker of candlelight, in the hush after laughter, in the ache of memory and the hunger for meaning, they lived. And in their living, they changed the world. Not with noise or force, but with quiet persistence. Because the weirdest addictions were not to things. They were to the very essence of being human. And through them, the Middle Ages breathed not just in darkness and fear, but in wonder. In stories told beside fires, in silences shared under stars, in the fragile hope that even the strangest hunger could feed a soul. Mathil laid down his spade one final time and looked to the horizon. The sun was rising, and so was a new day. Would you like me to help you with an introduction, summary, or anything else for this story?